You're listening to Simply the Best Sports Take, the best podcast breaking down the best stuff in sports with host Sean Bingham. His takes are so good, he dropped the mic, but then you wouldn't be able to hear him, and that would suck.
Welcome into STB Sports Take, Simply the Best Sports Podcast. I am your host, Sean Bingham, and the Jazz disrespect continues. This is getting unbelievable. So we're gonna talk all about that. We're gonna talk MVP candidates. We're now at the halfway point of the season. The All-Star break is here. I've kind of been saving my MVP talk until today. That's kind of what I had prepared for today. And then the All-Star draft happened last night. This was unbelievable. I'm very, very confused at the disrespect that is being given to the Utah Jazz by both LeBron James, Kevin Durant, and it feels like the league in general. Last night, the Jazz, who, by the way, are in first place in the entire NBA, not just in the West, but in first place in the entire league by 2.5 games. And that's after losing 4 of their last 7 or something like that. They've had a horrible road trip to kind of round out the end of the first half of the season. And even with that, they're 2.5 games out in front of the next closest team, but yet nobody seems to respect them. And the Jazz need to take this personally. If you're Donovan Mitchell, if you're Rudy Gobert, if you're on the Utah Jazz, if you're Quinn Snyder, who's coaching the All-Star game, you need to take this as disrespect and let it light a fire inside of you and come back stronger than ever. Because the truth is, the Jazz haven't proven anything yet. I hate to say it, Jazz fans. I live in Utah. I'm a Jazz fan. But as someone who loves sports more than any one individual team, I have to be real, especially doing this podcast. My goal is to be credible and to be real. And the truth is the Jazz have not proven anything yet. That happens in the postseason. And I think you're seeing guys like LeBron James and Kevin Durant, who have won multiple titles, and they've been MVPs and all these things. I think you're seeing them tell us exactly how they feel about the Utah Jazz, and that is they're not scared of the Utah Jazz. I don't know that anybody really is, and I don't know that they really should be just yet. Don't get me wrong, the Jazz are a fantastic team. I had them number 1 in my power rankings last week. They would not be there right now. That would probably be the Brooklyn Nets. But even then, I said that to me, the Jazz, while they are number 1 in the power rankings at that time, I said at full strength, you still got to give it to the Lakers, the Nets, potentially even the Clippers. I do think the Jazz could beat the Clippers in a playoff series. And what happened? Last year, this is a very similar thing to the Jazz, right? Last year, everybody had the Clippers as the team to beat in the West, or even in the entire NBA. It was like, how on earth are you going to beat this team? They've got Paul George, they've got Kawhi Leonard, they've got Patrick Beverley. They had all these like tenacious defenders on top of really prolific scorers with Lou Williams and then, of course, Paul George and Kawhi Leonard being two-way players. But what happened is they go into the Western Conference playoffs. It was in the bubble, so I'm curious to see what happens this season. But they go into the playoffs in the bubble, and Playoff P is, that's the most laughable name that's ever existed. It's almost like he created it for himself as a parody because it's the opposite. He is so unclutch. It's laughable. But anyway, they go into the bubble and they lose. They don't even make it to the Western Conference Finals. They lose in the second round to the Denver Nuggets. And now nobody's scared of the Clippers. Like, people get that the Clippers are a good team and could do some damage, and you got to take them seriously, but you're not fearing them. And that fear goes a long, long way. When you can strike fear into your opponent, it goes a long, long way. That's a huge advantage that Michael Jordan had his entire career. Everybody was scared of him. Everybody knew he was going to win. Similar thing with Tom Brady. He strikes fear into opponents. And the Jazz, speaking of Tom Brady and the Utah Jazz and making these comparisons, the Jazz haven't proven anything yet. They haven't. It's not cool. Utah's not viewed as cool. Having lived in Utah most of my life, I grew up in Northern Virginia in the D.C. area, and moved to Utah when I was a kid. And I've traveled the world and I've lived in other places, but Utah has been home for quite some time. And if you're looking for like big city stuff, clubs, bars, millions and millions of people, yeah, Utah's not the place for you. Utah's strengths are, while it does have, some decent city life in Salt Lake, Utah's strengths are the outdoors, the quality of life. We've got a lot of other things to offer, but there are things that a lot of NBA stars don't really value. It's not Miami, it's not New York, it's not Los Angeles, it's not Chicago, and so it's just viewed as not being cool, which I think, and again, I'm biased, I live here. I think it's an unfair assessment of the state. I think it's one of the most underrated places on earth. But again, I'm a really outdoorsy guy. I like that kind of thing. I value that kind of thing. I'm not really looking to go to clubs and whatnot. I'm more of a snowboarder and an outdoorsy guy. So it's just viewed as not being cool. And what changes quickly, though, look at Tampa Bay. Tampa Bay is not Miami. Tampa Bay is not cool. It might be in a warm climate, but it's not a cool city. Like, you never hear about Tampa Bay being this like amazing place, And not only is it not cool, but they were the losingest franchise in all of American sports. All of American sports, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers had the worst winning percentage in all of sports. That's the NFL, Major League Baseball, the NBA, and MLS, Major League Soccer, and the NHL. So of those 5 major team sports, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers had literally the worst winning percentage of all of the teams in those leagues, on top of being in an uncool city. But what happens? One guy, Tom Brady, decides that he's going to go play there, and now everybody wants to play there. They go win a Super Bowl, and it's just like an avalanche of talent that wants to go and be there because now it's cool. And so if the Jazz want to flip the script, if they don't want to get picked dead last, which I haven't even mentioned, you guys already know that's what I'm getting at. The 2 Jazz players, Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, were picked dead last in yesterday's All-Star draft. And if they want to flip the script, if they want to make people fear them, if they want to be respected, if they want to make people think that Utah is cool, go win a title. Go do some serious damage in the playoffs. Beat LeBron's Lakers. Beat Kawhi and Paul George's Clippers. Beat the Nuggets, Get at least to the Western Conference Finals and make it interesting. At the very, very least, they've got to do something like that. But a first-round exit, a second-round exit, I'm sorry, nobody cares if you go and win 60 games. You're like that Atlanta Hawks team from years ago. I didn't take them seriously. I looked at the Hawks and I was like, nah. And you know who else I kind of looked at like that? Was the 2004 Detroit Pistons. The 2004 Detroit Pistons, I was like, yeah, they're good. I get it. They're winning a ton of games. They're in the East. The East back then was like not as good. Well, then they go and beat the Lakers in 5 games in the finals, and everybody's like, oh, shoot, the Pistons are for real. And they were very similar to the Jazz. No superstars. They had stars, but no superstars. And I've talked about this before, but they've got the defensive stopper in Ben Wallace. They had Rasheed Wallace, who was also kind of an angry type of player. Could shoot the 3, also a good defender. Then they had Chauncey Billups, Mr. Big Shot, clutch, point guard, distributor. They had Rip Hamilton, Tayshaun Prince. Like, it was very, I look at Tayshaun Prince as kind of like a Bojan Bogdanovic. I look at Rip Hamilton as our Donovan Mitchell, and Mike Conley and Chauncey Billups. And, they had Ben Wallace as Rudy Gobert. Like, there's so many similarities. A great coach. Theirs was, Larry Brown, and obviously ours is Quinn Snyder. He's, in my opinion, Coach of the Year to this point, and he should have been Coach of the Year before. I mean, what he's accomplishing with his roster is phenomenal. The team play that he's got them all buying into, the Jazz play like a team, just like that Pistons team did. So if they want to make an impact, San Antonio, look at San Antonio. San Antonio is a small market. They have won 5 titles. San Antonio's not cool. Like, nobody thinks like, oh man, why do I want to go to a cool city? Like, let's go to San Antonio. Like that's about as low on the list as Salt Lake City is. And so it's not cool to be in San Antonio. It's not cool to be in Tampa Bay. It's not cool to be in Salt Lake City. But winning is cool. Winning is really cool. Winning changes a lot, It's like in business, like work is not so fun until you start making a grip of money. Then all of a sudden you're like, this is actually a pretty fun job. And so something that's not cool, that's not fun, changes quickly when the result changes. So if your job sucks, but you're making a grip of money, you probably stick with it because all of a sudden it's kind of fun because making money is fun. If your city's not cool, but all of a sudden you're winning championships and all that comes with that, then all of a sudden it's kind of cool to be in Utah. So this is now a challenge to the Utah Jazz, Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, and I'm very excited to see what they do with it. Quinn Snyder and all of the guys involved. So those are the 3 guys on the Jazz that are involved in the All-Star game. But I'm very excited to see what they do with it. So let's pull up the draft. This is obviously what I'm talking about. Yesterday, which I do love this draft that they do for the All-Star game. I think it's so fun because it's so telling because of stuff like this. To see who these guys take. In years past, they were not taking James Harden. And I remember thinking that's so telling. Like, they don't see him the same way that the media sees him or some of the fans see him or as he sees himself. And LeBron and Giannis in years past kind of confirmed that, right? And so I love the draft. I think it's so fun to mix up the conferences and just say, hey, here are the All-Stars from the conferences, but you're not going to be on those teams. We're gonna anoint team captains based on fan votes, and then let's see. Let's let you guys do a schoolyard pick, and here's how the schoolyard pick went. So if you're on YouTube, I'll put it up. So obviously the captains were LeBron and KD. KD's not playing; he's injured. But LeBron went first, and he picked Giannis, who Giannis had been the captain the last couple of years. But Kevin Durant makes the shift over to the Eastern Conference, and he got more votes than Giannis, so he was the captain. So Giannis, then Kyrie, then Steph, then Joel Embiid, then Luka, Kawhi, Jokic, Bradley Beal, and then Jason Tatum by default became a starter because of the votes, and he replaced Kevin Durant. So then he by default was the last pick. And then they went to the reserves. So in the reserves, it went Harden first, and Durant was picking first now in the second round. So Durant goes with Harden, and then LeBron goes with Damian Lillard. Then Booker, Simmons, Zion, Chris Paul, Zach LaVine, Jaylen Brown, Julius Randle, Paul George, Nikola Vucevic, Domantas Sabonis, Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert. So the number one team in the NBA has 2 All-Stars. Their coach is the coach of the All-Star game, one of the coaches of the All-Star game, and their 2 players go dead last. The amount of disrespect is crazy. That is a blatant statement by the league, not the league like the NBA, but the league, the players, of like, we don't fear these guys. We don't respect them. We don't even want them on our team. We just have to take them. I mean, look at the guys taken above Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell. I get that it's an all-star game, and so Rudy Gobert is like not exactly the flashiest offensive guy. He's an all-star 90% because of his defensive abilities. But he does average 15 points a game. He's not a slouch. And he did score 21 points in last year's All-Star game. So, but I get him going, pretty low on the list. But Donovan Mitchell, second to last? You're going to pick Vucevic, Domantas Sabonis, Julius Randle, Zach LaVine, Jaylen Brown, even Paul George. There are so many guys that I would pick after Donovan Mitchell, or so many guys that I would pick Donovan Mitchell. I would pick Donovan Mitchell ahead of so many guys. That's what I'm trying to say. Sorry. There's so many guys that I would pick Donovan Mitchell ahead of. Like, it's crazy. Like, Devin Booker wasn't even a real All-Star. Devin Booker's never been a real All-Star. He's been an All-Star twice, but only by default because guys got hurt. Jaylen Brown? You really think Jaylen Brown is better than Donovan Mitchell? The Celtics are a barely above average team, and he's not even their best player. Donovan Mitchell is on the best team, and he's the best player. And they play similar positions. Paul George, on name only, Paul George is better than Donovan Mitchell. On real performance, I think Donovan Mitchell is better. Look what they did in the playoffs to him, So, Vucevic, and when I say playoffs to him, I mean when Paul George was on the Thunder and the Jazz beat the Thunder in the playoffs. But Vucevic, Julius Randle, Zach LaVine. Zach LaVine's team sucks, and he is the best player on that team, and he's flashy and cool, but Donovan Mitchell's flashy and cool. and he's on the best team. And his numbers are so deserving. Devin Booker, again, wasn't even a real all-star. Zion Williamson, super flashy, actually has really impressive numbers. I'm not going to argue too much there, but Donovan Mitchell is the better player. The only guys that are like surefire better than Donovan Mitchell that went in the second round, which is, again, they have to pick among the starters, then they pick among the reserves. So from James Harden down through Rudy Gobert, that was the pool of players that Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert were up against. I would say James Harden and Damian Lillard, it's tough to argue taking Donovan Mitchell ahead of either of them. But after that, I could argue any one of those names. Donovan Mitchell is better than them. Any single one of them. And I'd be right on most. Then you'd get you're kind of like, splitting hairs when it comes to certain guys like Zion or Chris Paul. They're different. Chris Paul adds a lot of value. I think he's better than Ben Simmons. I've gone over that a bunch. Ben Simmons' fake rookie year and all that stuff and the rivalry. But this was a clear statement, a very clear statement. And it might be mind games. It might be LeBron and KD, LeBron in particular, playing mind games. I think LeBron has come out and said that Damian Lillard was the most disrespected player in the league, and then Devin Booker behind him. Or no, he said Devin Booker was the most disrespected player in the league, Damian Lillard behind him. And I think KD and him were kind of like making a statement here. KD, of course, took his teammates, Kyrie and James Harden. But then LeBron takes Lillard as his first pick, and then the very next pick, right on cue, is Devin Booker, the two guys that LeBron says are so disrespected. Well, the two most disrespected guys in the league now are Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell, and I hope so much that they have it in them to have that light of fire and improve their performance, because this last road trip leading into the break was pathetic. It was a pathetic showing by the Utah Jazz, dropping game after game, right after they have been given so much love by the media, and the pressure comes in and they kind of folded a little bit. So I hope this lights a fire under them, but this was a very clear statement from Kevin Durant and LeBron James that they just don't really care for Utah. They don't fear Utah. They don't think Utah's cool. They don't think Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert are cool. They almost don't even think they're deserving to be in the All-Star game. It feels like that kind of statement. And the TNT crew who was broadcasting the draft, they even said something like, hey, this is what's with the Utah Jazz slander. This is the number one team in the league, and their two best players are still sitting on the board. What's going on here? And LeBron, in his defense, I think he was trying to say, hey, look, it's no slander, it's no disrespect, but he almost made it worse. And he said, just like in video games, when you're growing up, like, Nobody plays with the Utah Jazz. I don't play with the Utah Jazz. Like, I don't care about the Utah Jazz. They're not cool enough to even like play with them as on my video games. Well, we've got a couple pictures here I'm putting up on YouTube of LeBron doing. He said no matter how good John Stockton and Karl Malone were, you don't play with the Utah Jazz when you're growing up on video games. Well, here's two photos of LeBron in very different years doing a dunk that Karl Malone was the first one to do, and well, maybe he wasn't the first, but he's known for it. It's like his signature move. I actually think it's a super lame dunk, but it is Karl Malone's thing. And here's very obvious photos of LeBron doing those dunks, with the hand behind the head. And then part of me thinks maybe he's just jealous. The Utah Jazz have the highest rated NBA Finals in NBA history. Obviously, I get it. Michael Jordan was 90% of the reason for that. I'm a huge Jordan fan. I was actually cheering for the Bulls during that time. Long story, but the short version is, it's not a long story. It's a very short story. I grew up in the D.C. area. I was obsessed with sports from a very young age. And the Washington Bullets at the time, they're now the Washington Wizards, but they were the Washington Bullets at the time. They stunk. And my 5-year-old brain was like, well, the Bulls is really close to the Bullets. It's like almost the same name. And they've got this really cool guy, Michael Jordan. I was born in 81. Jordan came into the league in 84. So he's in like his third, fourth season by the time I'm 5'6", really loving sports. And he was clearly the flashiest, coolest, best player in the league. He played for a team with a near identical name. So I became a diehard Michael Jordan and Chicago Bulls fan. And that lasted for many years, even several years after I moved to Utah. So I was actually cheering for the Bulls as a kid in high school, junior high and high school. I was cheering for the Bulls over the Utah Jazz in those finals. So, but I don't even know how I got off on that tangent now. But I do remember now. So LeBron's saying, you don't play with the Utah Jazz. Well, those finals were the highest rated finals in NBA history, the Jazz and Bulls finals. LeBron's finals, the lowest rated in NBA history. His bogus bubble championship from last year, I don't want to disrespect it too much because it was just the system that everybody was placed in, and he came out on top. So it is a championship, but it's definitely not the same as a regular championship. And I guarantee if you put guys like Anthony Davis on a polygraph and you said, hey, AD, do you want to quote unquote win a real one now? He would say yes, or he would say no and fail the polygraph if he said no. Because I guarantee you he does not value it the same as he would value a title that was in a regular environment, packed arenas, having to travel, a real environment with fans, and fans and travel in particular make a humongous difference. None of that existed in the bubble. It was like a glorified AAU tournament, and so. And that was the lowest rated finals in NBA history. So maybe LeBron's a little jealous. Okay, enough of that. Jazz, take it personal. Go make a difference. Let's see what you guys can do. I want to talk now about, we're at the midway point, and I've got a ton of cool stats pulled up, and I want to talk about the MVP race. I'm going to drag this screen over a little bit. Okay, so we're at the halfway point of the season, and the guys that are being talked about the most for the MVP are LeBron, Jokic, Embiid, Harden. I'm hearing his name thrown out there quite a bit. Probably in order, it would be Embiid, LeBron, Harden, and then I'd say Jokic fourth. And those are really the only names I'm hearing from the media. So I would add in there Giannis, right? So it's a kind of interesting phenomenon, the MVP voting. For whatever reason, a guy does something like average a triple-double, and we give him the MVP. The next year, he does the exact same thing, and he's literally not even in the discussion. And of course, I'm talking about Russell Westbrook. For whatever reason, the media was like, oh, well, we gave it to him last year. Like, it's not interesting anymore. We don't care. Well, he did the exact same thing. He dragged a team that was below average to the playoffs, and he averaged a triple-double while doing it. And they're just like, nah, not that cool. It was cool last year, not this year. And it feels like Giannis is the victim of that this year, because Giannis is averaging 29 points a game, 11.7 rebounds. His PER is third in the league at 29.03. His real plus minus is 6.29, which is really good. His team's in third in the East, which isn't great, but it certainly isn't bad. And his defensive win shares, he's 19th. He's shooting nearly 56% from the field. Like, there's nothing. His opponent's field goal differential is a minus 4.5, which is really good. There's nothing that Giannis has done to like slip, fall off a cliff. Like, he shouldn't even be in the discussion. He's the two-time reigning MVP, and he's not even being discussed, despite his numbers being phenomenal still. So that's a very interesting phenomenon. Giannis has to be in the mix. He is in my mix. I have the same other guys as well. Obviously, Embiid is having a phenomenal season, by far the best season of his career. LeBron is always in the discussion because he's just that good. Harden, I've told you on a couple of occasions that to me, Harden is really proving just how good he is, and how valuable he is. The year he won the MVP, it was kind of a similar thing where it's like he's doing he's scoring 35 a game, getting 11 assists or whatever it was. But I knew, like, this is not championship play. The Houston Rockets are not a real threat. That's how I viewed the Houston Rockets. And I was right. They never really were a threat except that one year with Chris Paul. And we talked about that yesterday. He got injured and didn't get to play that Game 7 against the Warriors. But James Harden has changed his game a little bit. He's shooting fewer shots. He's averaging a lot fewer points. But to me, it's actually a more valuable and more impressive style of play that actually could lead to a championship. And then another guy that's not being talked about at all, at least not that I'm hearing, is Damian Lillard. Damian Lillard has the Blazers at 21-14, fifth in the West, and that's without CJ McCollum for most of the season and without Jusuf Nurkic for most of the season. So the second and third best players on that team are not playing, and they're 21-14 in the Western Conference, fifth in the West. And they have literally one guy. It's like you probably listening can't even think of another name outside of Damian Lillard, CJ McCollum, and Jusuf Nurkic on the Blazers. I mean, I'm thinking Hassan Whiteside, Zach Collins, but like, are these guys that are really worth even discussing? Zach Collins isn't playing either. And so he's got nothing to work with. Gary Trent Jr. is pretty good. I mean, obviously they've got players, and I could go into deep stuff, but the average fan knows those three guys: Lillard, McCollum, Nurkic. Most might not even know Nurkic. And two of those three aren't playing, but yet Lillard's got his team 5th in the West. His PER is 26.63. I think that's like 12th. I didn't write it down here, but it's high. It's good. He's 3rd in the league in points per game at 29.8, averaging 8 assists a game, shooting 93.3% from the foul line and 38.4% from three, which is not a phenomenal three-point percentage, but given the degree of difficulty that his shots are, the depth that he's taking them from, the defense is being so incredibly keyed on him, double and triple teams, and he's still shooting 38.4% from three, averaging nearly 30 points a game. So Damian Lillard has to be in the discussion. The biggest knock on him is really his defense, but it's not even that big of a knock. His defensive win shares are not good, but they are a positive. It's not like he's negatively affecting the defense too much. And opponents actually are shooting a lower percentage when guarded by him than they are when guarded by others. So the opponent field goal percentage differential is one of my favorite defensive stats, because if you're so good defensively, people will look at the obvious like blocks and steals, but that only tells a very small part of the picture. A lot of guys can get a bunch of steals by cheating into passing lanes and things like that, where actually they're getting beat on back doors and other things that don't show up in the stat sheet. The standard traditional stats, but they do show up in defensive win shares and things like that. But opponent's field goal percentage is a big one, because if you're such a good lockdown defender, what percentage are guys shooting when you guard them versus when other guys guard them? And Damian Lillard's actually is, it's not great, but it actually is a minus 1.6, and you want your number to be minus, meaning they're shooting a lower percentage when defended by you than they are by others. And so his actually is a minus 1.6. So there's not really a huge knock on Damian Lillard. And for those watching on YouTube, I've got stats here up on the board, up on the screen, and if it's in green, that obviously means that's really good. Yellow is like kind of neutral, and these are of course MVP standards compared to the rest of the league. This would all just probably be green, with the exception of a few. And then the red is something that's kind of like a ding on his resume, a knock on his resume. And you'll notice I put his record, the 21-14 record, I actually put it in green because of the degree of difficulty at which he's doing it. Because when it comes to the MVP chatter, you have to take into account the standard traditional stats. Those are important. You have to take into account the advanced metrics, which is like PER, defensive win shares, opponent's field goal differential, real plus minus, which Damian Lillard is 8th in real plus minus. Real plus minus is another really cool stat that I'll explain briefly. It goes by your offensive real plus minus on per 100 possessions. So it takes 100 possessions, and it just says, okay, offensively speaking only, how many more points is the team scoring per 100 possessions when he's on the floor versus when he's not? And then it does the same thing on defense. How many points is the team giving up per 100 possessions when he's on the floor versus when he is not? And then it combines the two and says, here's the real overall impact this player has on the court. And Damian Lillard is 8th in the league at a 4.91. So his real plus minus, the team is getting an average of 5 more points ahead. And that's, again, per 100 possessions, defensive, offensive, combine them. And it's a really, really actually neat stat. It's a very telling stat. And as I was filtering down these different things, I look at defensive real plus minus, offensive real plus minus. You saw huge discrepancies with some players, Jokic being the key culprit. His defensive real plus minus is horrible. His offensive real plus minus is really high. And so his real total plus minus is really positive. Same thing with James Harden. And so Steph Curry is another one. So if their offense is so great that it outweighs the negative impact that their defense is, they get a little bit of a pass. And so I went with real plus minus. And again, Lillard is 8th. Okay, let's move on to James Harden. Points. He's 25.3. I've already said I think that's actually a positive thing because even though it's fewer, I actually think it's a positive. I've got it in yellow because he's not among the top 5 or even 10 guys in the league in points per game. But 25.3 is obviously really good. Assists and rebounds, doing great. 40% from three. That actually surprised me. I thought Harden was more of like a 35% from three guy, 37, 38 tops. When I think of the volume that Harden and Lillard shoot threes at, I would have put Lillard as the better three-point shooter, but Harden actually is at 40.1. Very impressive. Turnovers are his big Achilles heel. 4.2 turnovers per game. His defensive win shares, not good, 0.054, which is really low. And then his opponent's field goal differential, opponents actually shoot better when James Harden is defending them than they do when others are defending them, which means the average NBA defender gives people a harder time making a bucket than James Harden does. So that's the biggest knock on him. Okay, next guy, LeBron James. Very similar to James Harden in the points, rebounds, and assists. They're very, very similar. Harden is leading the league in assists. But LeBron and James Harden almost identical in points and rebounds, and their assists are a little bit different. But LeBron's biggest Achilles heel is his free throw shooting. 69.2%. And the other thing is that's hurting LeBron that I put it in yellow, third in the West, team record, 24-13. But we talked yesterday, without Anthony Davis, they're 7-7. They're a 500 team without Anthony Davis. And so that's a little bit of a knock on LeBron. Defensive win shares, though, LeBron is second. Second in the league in defensive win shares, and his opponents shoot 5.4% worse when he defends them than they do against others. So that's really, really good as well. And then LeBron's real plus minus is first in the league. First in the league, LeBron's real plus minus. That's a very telling stat. 8.83. It was actually first by quite a bit. So that was a very impressive stat by LeBron. Okay, next guy. We're going to go to Jokic. Jokic, 27.1 points per game, 11 rebounds, 8.6 assists, shooting 56.7% from the field, 41.8, 42% from three, 88% from the line. He's first in PER. So many impressive offensive stats. But then you get to defensive stuff. Opponents are shooting better when he defends them than when others defend him. His win share, defensive win shares, is 117th in the league. His real plus minus is okay. It was not in the top 10. And his team is underachieving. So there's a lot of talk out there for Jokic to be MVP because of the 27, 11, and almost 9. But you start to look into some of these deeper metrics. PER, he was first in the league at 31.61. So that was obviously the most impressive statistic of all of his was his PER. But then you get down to defensive win shares, real plus minus, opponent field goal differential, and his team's record. And all of those things are kind of like ding, 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 like negative dings that kind of knock him down a little bit. And so I would put Jokic right there in the thick of things, but not the MVP. Giannis, we talked about him already. He's third in PER. Opponents do shoot quite a bit worse when he defends them, and his real plus minus is very high at 6.29. But the MVP to me up to this stage of the season is Joel Embiid. He is second in PER, second in points per game, fifth in real plus minus. His team is in first place in the East. He hasn't missed too many games. I think he's missed 6, which isn't too bad. He's shooting 52% from the field, 41.6% from three, 85.6% from the line. The only ding that I have on him, which isn't really even a ding, is his assists at 3.3. I think he's fifth in the league in rebounds. Like, he's just dominating across the board, and his team is dominating in the East. They're in first place. They just beat the Jazz, we talked about that, and that was kind of a ripoff, but they did just beat the Jazz, who are the best team in the league at this point. There's really nothing that he's doing poorly. His opponents shoot 3.5% worse when he defends them than when others do, which is obviously a good thing. It's not great, but it's good defensively. His defensive win shares, he's 18th in the league. Literally down the line, everything you can look at, the eye test tells me that he's doing it, and all the metrics do. His team results scream it. The only thing that I didn't love was his assists at 3.3, but he's a big man, and big men don't get many assists, so it's not really much of a ding. So to this point in the season, Joel Embiid would be my MVP, and In second place, I honestly would put Damian Lillard, and nobody's talking about him. I would put Damian Lillard as second, and I'd probably put Harden third, LeBron fourth, and Giannis fifth. That would be my top 5, and I would put Jokic as a sixth place. So those are my top 6, with Embiid taking the lead. So that is all the time we have for today, guys. I hope you're enjoying this podcast. I hope you're subscribed. Whether you're listening on Spotify, watching on YouTube, listening on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, on the Anchor app, whatever it is, please subscribe to the podcast. Please share the podcast. It helps me a ton, and you guys can be with it from the beginning as we grow. Remember, if you download the Anchor app or if you go to the website, it is easier. I've tested it. It is easier if you download the Anchor app. You can actually send in a voice message. You can record it. So it'd be like making a phone call, to a radio host. You can send in your hot take, your question, your debate. Tell me how dumb I am. Tell me how great I am. Whatever you want to do to debate or ask a question. And I can play it in an upcoming episode, which would be really fun. So you can go to STB Sports Take within the Anchor app, STB Sports Take, or Simply the Best Sports Podcast. The URL is anchor.fm/STB Sports Take, and you can check that out. Would love to have you guys submit some takes. It'd be really, really fun. But that's all the time I have for today. Have a fantastic weekend. Looking forward to this All-Star game. I am out. Peace.
Thanks for hanging with Simply the Best Sports Take. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast and check out stbsportstake.com. Simply the best in sports.
'Cause we are warriors.